4 of your companies went bankrupt, Mr. Trump.
You know what? I have, of the 71 companies I have, those 4 that I threw into a chapter, and they were just 4, not me personally, these were just 4 out of many, many companies caused by the Bill Bradleys of the world who created a ridiculous tax structure. Those 4 companies did very, very well. I used the system as to my advantage, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't like the idea of privatizing Social Security. I think it's certainly something that can be looked at. Who knows better about hard times than me? I had a company, it was doing well.
What gave Colbert's segment such impact wasn't the discovery of some hidden scandal. It was the way he paired Donald Trump's own words from 1999 with a modern court decision, letting viewers draw the connection on their own. The audience heard Trump describe business tactics he once celebrated as smart strategy, walking away from unfavorable deals, assigning higher values to assets, and using every advantage the system allowed. At the time, he framed those methods as proof of exceptional business instincts. 25 years later, however, a New York judge reviewed financial records, witness testimony, and extensive evidence before concluding that many of those same practices had crossed the legal line into fraud. Colbert didn't need dramatic narration or over-the-top accusations. The contrast carried the story by itself. On one side stood Trump, confidently explaining how he believed business should be done. On the other stood a court ruling explaining why those same actions became the focus of one of
that Donald Trump had to either fork over $464 million or Attorney General Letitia James was going to grab him by
the most significant fraud cases involving a modern political figure. That tension lingered throughout the entire segment. For years, Trump persuaded many supporters that every investigation targeting him was a politically motivated witch hunt. Every lawsuit, he argued, was driven by bias, and every criticism came from people who simply failed to understand success. But the 1999 interview created a unique challenge because it wasn't supplied by political opponents, prosecutors, or television commentators. The source was Trump himself. Every explanation, every boast, and every defense came directly from his own words, spoken long before any courtroom battle had begun. For many older viewers, the moment carried particular significance. They came from a time when public statements were expected to remain consistent over the years. If someone openly described a business approach in one era, and a court later ruled that the same conduct amounted to fraud, the contradiction became difficult to dismiss. Colbert recognized that the strongest evidence is often not an accusation at all. It is a comparison.
Really rich.
There you go. There you go. That checks out. And last week, his lawyers claimed that for their super rich client, securing the bond would be a practical impossibility. Aha! Caught you now! He's not a real rich guy. He just plays one on TV.
He simply placed the past beside the present and trusted the audience to connect the dots. That approach transformed a late-night television segment into a much broader discussion about accountability. Was Trump simply explaining his philosophy of doing business in 1999? Or was he unknowingly describing the very conduct that would later place him inside a courtroom decades afterward? By the close of the segment, that question hung over everything. The old interview had become more than archival footage. It had turned into a time capsule, reminding viewers that the most revealing testimony about a public figure does not always come from critics searching for damaging.
He is, the more the crowd loves him.
To pay the bond or their fines or
No, I don't do that. I think you'd be allowed to possibly.
Material. Sometimes it comes from the person's own past, speaking freely, without any idea that those words would one day be revisited. Years later, when financial records were scrutinized and legal findings were issued, explanations that once sounded like confidence suddenly carried a very different meaning. That is exactly why the clip spread so quickly. Colbert didn't manufacture a storyline. He simply pressed play, allowed Trump's own words to unfold, and left viewers to decide whether they were listening to a businessman describing success or a future defendant describing conduct that would later be labeled fraudulent. At that point, the discussion expanded beyond a single interview, a single court ruling, or even a late-night comedy show. It became a conversation about a pattern that critics say has followed Trump for decades. The pattern appeared straightforward. When a strategy worked in his favor, Trump called it brilliance. When the same conduct faced legal scrutiny, he called the process unfair. When evidence surfaced, he argued it was politically motivated. When critics highlighted inconsistencies, he accused them of being obsessed with him. The reason the 1999 interview resonated so deeply was that it cut through those familiar defenses all at once. There was no hostile journalist asking loaded questions, no Democratic official making accusations, no prosecutor standing behind a podium. There was only Donald Trump speaking openly about how he viewed business, debt, negotiations, risk, and success. Viewers watched a younger Trump explain those methods with complete confidence, never imagining that decades later, those same explanations would be measured against a fraud ruling carrying hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties. That was the moment the studio grew quiet. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. Once the two timelines were placed beside each other, the connection seemed to emerge naturally. For decades, Trump's public image rested on the belief that he succeeded because he understood the system better than everyone else. He knew the loopholes, he knew the deals, he knew the banks, he knew how to make the system work in his favor. That reputation endured because most people saw the image rather than the paperwork. They saw skyscrapers, television appearances, magazine covers, and famous slogans. Few ever examined the financial statements, asset valuations, or detailed records behind the brand. But courtrooms operate under different rules than campaign rallies. At a rally, confidence can persuade a crowd. Inside a courtroom, evidence must carry the argument. According to the court's ruling, the evidence showed that Trump's business empire repeatedly presented inflated asset values in order to secure favorable loans and financial advantages. Colbert understood that this, not Trump's reaction to the ruling, or whether supporters accepted it, was the real story. What mattered was how closely Trump's own explanation from 1999 resembled the conduct later analyzed in court. That was why the audience laughed when the old interview first appeared, then gradually became more attentive as the comparison unfolded. Comedy opened the conversation, but the documented facts kept viewers engaged. Perhaps the most striking part of the entire segment was that Trump wasn't being secretive during the original interview. He was proud of what he was saying. He believed he was explaining the mindset of a successful businessman. He thought he was giving viewers insight into how winners think. Yet years later, those same remarks became difficult to separate from the allegations that eventually followed him into court. The central issue became the line between aggressive business tactics and fraud. Who decides where that boundary exists? A businessman defending his methods on television, or a judge reviewing years of financial records under oath? That question remained at the center of every minute of the segment. By the conclusion, Colbert no longer needed punchlines. The comparison itself had become the payoff. Trump had spent decades insisting that no one understood business better than he did. Then a courtroom spent weeks reviewing the business practices he once praised, and arrived at a conclusion he never anticipated. The audience was left with a reality that almost felt scripted. A recording made 25 years earlier no longer sounded like a defense. It sounded like a preview. An interview that had been largely forgotten suddenly resembled a roadmap. What once appeared to be self-promotion now looked more like self-documentation. That explains why the clip spread so widely